Okay, so Phil Reed, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today and the students at the University of Waterloo. The content, I think, of this interview is going to be very valuable to them in letting them help them think about what they're going to be doing in their future lives. So,
Well,
uh,
thank you
can,
thank you for asking me.
so can I start just by asking you about your role at the University of Swansea? What is it you do there? What's the focus of your work?
Well, I'm a professor of psychology here, and my interests are very, very broad, mainly connected with learning and motivation and the things that affect the way that we function and behave and think.
Those are good things to know about. So the first question I've got, an area that I think you've looked at, is about internet addiction. And so what I'm keen to know is what it is. Can you describe it? And I understand that it's different from gaming addiction. We're talking about addiction to the internet, I guess, as a whole.
Yes, we are. Gaming addiction is very specific to a particular activity that you would conduct through the internet or social media. Let's just call all of those things internet because it's easier. Whereas addiction to the internet is, if you like, an overuse of that technology. And it has a number of different strands. Firstly, as with most addictions, it's not so much the amount of use, but it's the effect it has on your life. It's when you start to think that you're using this internet technology too much and it's stopping you from doing the other things that you really want to do. It's interfering with the rest of your life. And that's one major aspect of internet addiction and all sorts of other addictions. But beyond that, there are particular effects on the way that you feel and your physiology after you come off the internet. So it's more than just a feeling of interference with your life. You actually do get specific physical effects from withdrawal.
Okay, and so I was very interested in that part of your work when I read about it. What type of physiological effects are there from internet withdrawal?
It really depends on what purpose the internet addiction's serving. For most people, it's almost serving a calming effect. So it's acting rather like a de-stressor. What that means is that it's acting a bit like a barbiturate or any other form of drug that's actually serving to suppress our physiological activity. So when we stop it, you see this kind of rebound effect. So our physiology begins to get hyped up. We get increased heart rate, increased skin conductance, all signs of an increased arousal. We also get that associated with the release of all sorts of stress hormones, which can have a wide impact on neural function and immune function.
So someone will be able to feel that they are suffering from that withdrawal.
Yes, if you start to get anxious, if you start to get a bit twitchy when you're locked away from your mobile device or your mobile phone, you might start to feel a slight anxiety, a slight panic. Heart rate might increase a little bit. You might feel a tiny little bit sweaty or clammy, it's in the extreme cases, but certainly you feel anxious, you feel twitchy, like there's something missing, and you'll start feeling around for your mobile device.
Okay, and someone watching this, say a student or a young person particularly, but perhaps also someone older, what are the signs for them that they're addicted?
If you start to feel that you're missing out on other things, if you start to feel when you're using the internet that perhaps there are other things you should be doing, if other people start telling you that you're spending too much time away from them, and perhaps if you start preferring to use technology rather than being with other people, those are all danger signs that you may be investing too much of your life in this type of technology.
And as I understand it, your work has established that this problem is pretty bad. I mean, I know in my family, we had our 18-year-old niece living with us for, well, she was with us for a few years, but when she was about 18, we had a difference of opinion with her, and we had a point we wanted to make, and we took away her phone and her laptop, and the reaction was, very extreme, much more extreme than than the reaction to anything else that we may have done. So, how bad is the problem? How many people really suffer from this, do you think?
It's very hard to say because we as yet don't have an agreed definition that we can tick the criteria from. But the estimates put it anywhere in terms of severe internet addiction between about 1 and 5% of 16 to 25-year-olds, certainly in the Western world. It may have a higher prevalence in Southeast Asia. Beyond that, people who will say when you ask them or get them to complete a test, a psychometric test, we usually find around 30, maybe even 40% of that age group will start to say, I think this is getting a bit of a problem for me. It may not be a full-blown addiction, but they're beginning to realise that they are just spending too much time on this technology.
Yeah, I mean, those are big numbers. That's a lot of people. And, presumably the broader impact on society is something that is potentially important. If someone does think that they're addicted, having listened to what you've said, what could they do to shake that? Is it possible for them to break the addiction, and what should they do?
Oh, it's possible to break almost any addiction. You've got to work out a number of things. Firstly, when it is that you're using this and why it is you're using this. Try to go actively to limit your use. Perhaps don't carry your mobile with you, but certainly don't have it in your bedroom when you're sleeping. Limit the times of the day when you're actually going to respond to this or when you're going to use it. Think, what is it that I'm using it for? What's its primary function? Let's not get too disturbed by this. The internet is a fantastic information gaining tool. It can also allow us to do things like we're doing now, which is talk across continents. So there are lots of positives. But let's make sure we know what we're using it for and not fall into what you could call the YouTube hole or the Twitter hole, where you start to use it for one device and then you get sucked into all of the other things that you can see. Be very specific about why you're using it. Think about what joys you get from it, and can you get those from other things? Has it merely replaced those same types of pleasures that you used to get elsewhere? So it's a matter of thinking about what it is you're using it for, and also actively and consciously putting aside certain times of the day when you will use it and simply not carrying that access to the devices at other times.
Okay, and I've seen work that others have done that has argued that the internet changes people's brains. That there are physical changes, I guess, in people's brains. Do you agree with that, or do you have an opinion on that?
That's certainly true. And it's certainly true at a very trivial level that almost anything we do will change our brains. But beyond that, I think what we're seeing now is much more hard evidence that there are changes. And one of the key relationships here is to this hormone cortisol. As I said, cortisol is released when we're under stress. Cortisol has some very specific and known effects in the brain, which do link in with the effects we see in internet addiction. For example, it will swell the amygdala and to some extent the hippocampus. And they're involved in emotional control and also in memory. And will also reduce the size of the prefrontal cortex, which is where we have a lot of our higher functions, things like inhibition control and planning. So we're beginning to get a very good idea of the types of brain damage you get from excessive internet use, and indeed the mechanisms underlying that. So yes, I would say that the overuse of this type of technology does have an impact at more than a trivial level.
So there is so what you're arguing here is that the internet may change people's minds and their behavior in aspects of their life beyond their engagement with the internet.
Yes, it will impact the way you think, the way you behave, and importantly, that will change the way in which you interact in much of your other life as well. So it goes way beyond the internet, as do most addictions. This is not a unique problem. You see the same type of thing with gambling addiction or shopping addiction. Any type of addiction will change you, and will change you quite dramatically across a range of your behaviors.
Interesting. And you've also, I think in your work, looked at the internet and depression. Can you talk about how that impact happens?
Yeah, there's plenty of evidence, not just from our own work, but right across the world, that depression and overuse of the internet are very strongly related. Now, part of that is that depressed people actually seek out the internet. So there's that causal link that way. Beyond that, the internet will socially isolate people. The types of relationships you form via digital technology are not quite the same as real life associations. People don't find them as satisfying. And you do get increased amounts of social isolation and loneliness, which feeds into depression. There's also the issue of lots of social comparison, especially through the use of social media. Everyone on social media presents a version of their life, and they usually present the best version of their life. When you're looking at all of these fantastic lives, that can cause you to be dissatisfied with their own. So there are all sorts of reasons why people using the internet will become depressed, from the physiological effects to the social effects. And that is another type of causal link. So depressed people tend to seek out the internet and solace through it. The problem is that very tool which they're hoping will get them over their problem actually begins to make it worse.
This week I read some work that seemed to suggest that plastic surgery and alterations of people's appearance were being influenced by the internet. I think they called it Snapchat dysmorphia, I think was the term that was given for it. But that also seems to be part of work that you've done, in the sense that you've looked at how the internet may be making people more narcissistic.
Yeah, there's little doubt that the internet, social media are an incredibly prevalent aspect of our lives, and they influence almost every aspect of what we do. For instance, what we're doing now. On the one hand, this is an interview, this is a conversation that could not have happened 15 years ago in this form. We might have had to correspond, we may have rung each other up, but certainly we wouldn't have had this face-to-face ability to talk, and that's great. But the prevalence of it means that all of the things that used to influence us to be dissatisfied with our bodies or to want to impose ourselves on other people are now triggered through the internet as well as in real life. So it shouldn't really be a surprise that the internet actually has these types of effects.
Okay, and those effects are perhaps encouraged, you've suggested, companies that you've said before that they are contributing to the addiction, to the encouragement of people basically to spend as much time as possible using the internet.
That's what they want, because that's where they make their money. And there's nothing wrong with people making money, of course. What is wrong is making money at the expense of other people suffering. And I think there's an analogy here to be drawn between the attitudes of the internet companies and the attitudes perhaps of the cigarette companies in the 1950s and 1960s. As yet, I see very little signs of true responsibility from the internet companies about the potential harms that their technology may be inflicting on people. And I think there has to be a much greater awareness on the part of the companies that they have a great and potentially useful product, but that product, as with many products, has potential harmful side effects. And we really do need to start getting to grips with this. And the companies do need to start taking some responsibility for the products that they're putting out there.
Yeah, and which governments seem to be starting to look at this a bit more seriously than they have in the past. There have been some instances of regulation of technology in various ways recently. Do you have any suggestions on how they might deal with this too?
I'm not a great fan of regulation in that sense. We know that when some kind of drug or activity has been legal for a long period of time, it's impossible to make it illegal. If you think of prohibition in the 20th century in the United States, it simply doesn't work. It's a different matter if something hasn't been legal. It's still quite easy to keep it illegal for very, very good health reasons. But that's not the case with this technology. This is a major part of the world, and to try to directly regulate it in any sense, I think might be wrong-headed. What we do need to produce is much greater awareness of the harms. We can't keep running sort of headlong down a route that digital technology and the internet is going to solve all our problems, and just presenting this very biased positive representation of these types of technologies. We need a balance, and the best way to achieve this is just to let people know the potential harms and let them decide. If you start to tell people what to do, you'll have the opposite effect. Nobody wants to be told what to do. You'll just get a counter reaction and they'll do it more. What you have to do is let them decide, and the best way to do that is make sure that all of the information is available to them so they can come to the right decisions for themselves.
Okay, and one other area that that it's been argued the internet is having an impact in is the development of children's brains. So is there an argument, there are many parents out there who are now limiting the use of the internet by children. Have you got advice for them? How should a parent of a very young child approach their internet use?
Well, I think a parent of a very young child should simply say no. Children are far too young if they're preschool or even in the early stages of school to be using this type of technology. Parents take responsibility for their children's behaviour across a whole range of their lives, and they should not exclude their children's digital lives from that responsibility as well. Just because many parents don't necessarily have as good a handle on this thing as their children might, it's not a reason not to say, well, you can do this at this stage, but not at this stage. And there are very, very good reasons to do this beyond the potential psychological and social harms to the children. The internet and digital world is a very dangerous one. There are predators out there, and you would not let your children roam around the streets without knowing where they were or who they were with. Assume the internet is the same. You've got to take the same level of active supervision and guidance when your child is using the internet. Use it with them. If you wouldn't let your child walk around the streets alone, you shouldn't let them walk around the internet alone. And it's as simple as that. Assume this is just another part of your child's life that as a parent you need to take responsibility for. As the child gets older, you give the child more responsibility after teaching them appropriate ways to behave. And they get more and more autonomy. And it's the same with the internet. As they get older, they get more autonomy. But you're still the parent. You're still the one in charge.
Good advice. And I have one other group of people that I'd like you to consider advice for, people you and I are both very familiar with. Professors have to deal with students with technology on a regular basis. Particularly, there are various opinions on how professors should approach the use of technology by students in the classroom. Is this something that you can help us with?
In many ways, I think professors now, we're caught between two forces. We do know that there's a great set of resources out there on the internet, and we all use them in our teaching. We all use them as very helpful tools, adjunct materials that we can get our students to access in a way that we never could when we were students, and that's fantastic. The amount of information that's out there, the amount of potential learning opportunities that are out there through the internet is a wonderful thing, and we do try to embrace that. The problem is that it can be overused. Most universities now have moved to providing virtual learning environments. The difficulty is, I think we've gone too far and assuming everything needs to be put through these learning environments. We're all asked to upload everything to the internet, to our system, so that all our lecture materials are there. I'm not sure that's such a great idea. I think it reduces the skill set of the students. So I would argue for a balanced approach to the types of materials that we're asking our students to access, because we simply don't want to be encouraging one type of learning skill at the expense of others. The other pressure is, of course, from students. They've grown up using these devices. That's what they do as a matter of course. And I think we have to start teaching students that it's a matter of courtesy not to be using these types of devices in lectures. We've all seen the lecture when we walk in and students have their laptops up or their mobiles out. And one of the things I think we need to start developing is a student would not think it's courteous to his or her peers to start a conversation with somebody in the lecture room. Neither should the student think it's courteous to his or her peers or their professor to start using the internet when the professor is talking with them. It's simply a matter of etiquette. So there are two issues here: appropriate use, and we all like the resources that we can gain through the internet, but let's not throw everything else out. We like to develop a range of skills in our students, so let's do that. And also to students, just think of the social etiquette here. Just think of your courtesy to your professor and to your fellow students about engaging in this type of behaviour during lectures.
More good advice. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today, Phil. I appreciate you doing it all the way from Wales.
Yeah, well, it's a great pleasure. I hope it's been of some use, and the sun is just beginning to go down here. It's just beginning to get a bit chilly, so I shall leave you to your glorious morning and afternoon.
Thanks.